There are memories we share easily, memories we laugh about, memories we offer to the world without hesitation. And then there are the other ones, the memories we tuck away in drawers, in pockets, in quiet corners of our minds where no one else can reach them. Ronald Reagan had such a memory, and for more than half a century, he carried it with him in the form of a single worn photograph no one ever saw. Not Nancy, not his children, not his closest aides, not even the doctors who sorted through his belongings in his final years. Only one person ever asked about the photograph. And even then, Reagan simply smiled and slipped it back into his wallet, as though protecting a fragile piece of himself. The photograph was always folded once down the middle, soft at the edges. The colors faded into warm sepia. Anyone who glimpsed it briefly might have mistaken it for a picture of distant relatives or a childhood neighbor. But the truth was deeper, stranger, far more human. The story behind that photograph began long before the presidency, long before Hollywood, long before Reagan learned how to make his voice fill a room. It began on a cold winter morning in the early 1930s. He was standing at a crossroads in his life and didn't even know it. He was barely in his 20s then, working whatever odd jobs he could find. Money was thin and hope was thinner. The Great Depression had wrapped itself around the Midwest like a long, relentless winter, and people were surviving on grit more than anything else. Reagan had dreams of coarse radio performing, telling stories, but dreams felt almost embarrassing in a world where grown men couldn't afford bread. Still, he held on to them quietly. As quietly as he held on to that photograph years later. On this particular morning, the wind cut like a blade. Snow clung to everything: trees, roofs. The edges of every fence post and each of Reagan's breaths came out in ghostly white clouds. He tugged his coat tighter and buried his chin into the collar. Trying to keep the cold from biting through, he had missed the early bus to a job interview in a nearby town, one of the few opportunities he'd had in weeks. The interview wasn't glamorous, just a clerk position at a warehouse. But it was a chance. And in those days, a chance was gold. The next bus wouldn't arrive for over an hour. He considered walking, but the distance was too far, the roads too icy. So he stood alone at the bus stop, stamping his feet to stay warm. Watching the snowflakes drift in slow circles around the dim lamppost beside him, that was when he first noticed the stranger. A man, older than Reagan by at least 20 years, walking unevenly along the edge of the road. He wore no hat, no gloves, just a thin coat that looked borrowed or stolen or simply forgotten by time. His shoulders slumped, and his steps wavered as if the wind itself were pushing him off balance. At first, Reagan assumed the man was drunk. This was a common enough sight during those hard years. But something about the stranger's movements felt different. There was no staggering, no weaving. Instead, the man walked with a strange numbness, a quiet surrender. So the cold were not biting him, but swallowing him whole. Reagan's breath hitched. He didn't know why, but the sight unsettled him. The man reached the lamppost and paused. His hands hung at his sides, fingers reddened and raw. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the ground. The snow gathering on his shoulders. Then Reagan saw his face. Not drunk, not angry, not lost, broken. The kind of break that doesn't come from one bad day, but from a long chain of them days that pile on top of each other until you're too tired to fight anymore. Reagan hesitated. He wasn't sure what to do. People rarely approached strangers back then, unless trouble forced them together. And Reagan, young and worried about missing his interview, felt that familiar tug of practicality telling him to stay put, to mind his own business, to let the man pass. But then, the stranger did something Reagan would never forget. He removed a small photograph from his coat pocket, stared at it for a long, trembling moment, and then slipped it carefully inside his shoe. Not a wallet, not a coat. His shoe, as if it were the last safe place in the world. The gesture was quiet, desperate, almost sacred. And it hit Reagan harder than he expected. Before he could stop himself, he spoke. "Sir, are you all right?" The man didn't respond, didn't even look up. Reagan stepped closer. "It's freezing out here." "You should," but the stranger finally turned toward him. Reagan fell silent. because the man's eyes held a look Reagan recognized instantly, a look he had seen in his own father some nights. A look he had seen in men who lost everything. A look made of resignation. The man spoke, voice thin and defeated. Cold doesn't matter much when there's nowhere warm to go. Reagan felt the words strike something deep in him, something he wasn't prepared for. He looked down the road instinctively, hoping someone else might appear, another traveler, a patrol officer, anyone. But the road was empty, stretching out like a long white ribbon into the early morning fog. Just him. Just the man. Just the cold. A bus rumbled in the distance. Not the one Reagan needed, but a sign of life nonetheless. He wasn't sure why, but something about that sound made him step closer to the stranger. "Look," Reagan said gently, "I'm headed into town. You can take my seat on the bus. It'll be warmer than standing out here." The man blinked slowly, as though the offer confused him. "You don't know me?" he murmured. Reagan shook his head. "I don't need to." The man stared at Reagan with a mixture of disbelief and weary gratitude. He opened his mouth to speak, but the cold caught his breath. Reagan removed his gloves and handed them over. "Take these." The stranger hesitated. "You'll freeze." "I've been colder," Reagan lied softly. The man accepted the gloves with trembling hands. For a moment something softened in his face, a faint spark of the person he used to be before life had its way with him. Then, out of nowhere, the man stumbled. His knees buckled, and he dropped to the snow. Reagan rushed forward, catching him before he hit the ground. The man's body was frighteningly light, as if hunger had hollowed him out. "I'm fine," the man whispered shakily, though he clearly wasn't. Reagan looked desperately down the road for help. The bus. Where was the bus? The stranger leaned toward him. "If you see her," he murmured suddenly, voice barely audible. "Tell her I tried." Reagan froze. "Tell who?" But the man's eyes shut, and he collapsed fully into Reagan's arms. "Sir. Hey, sir." His breath was shallow, irregular. The cold had sunk too deep. Reagan lowered him gently to the ground, panic rising. He slapped the snow with his free hand, trying to find traction, trying to think, trying to keep the man conscious. "Stay with me," Reagan pleaded. "Help is coming." But no help came, not then. Not quickly enough. Not for a man who had hidden a photograph in his shoe as if it were the last piece of himself he couldn't bear to lose. And as Aligan pressed his own coat over the man's chest, trying to warm him, trying to keep him tethered to the world, he felt something shifts, something deep, something irreversible. A belief, a responsibility, a vow, a moment that would echo through everything he would become. Because when the man's shoe loosened, and that photograph slipped out into the snow, Reagan picked it up and saw the face of the person the stranger had died trying to reach, and that face, that young, smiling face, would stay with him forever. The face he would fold carefully into his wallet. The face he would look at on hard days. The face he would never speak about. The face in the photograph, kept hidden all his life. For a moment that felt far longer than it truly was. Reagan knelt in the snow, his breath rising in frantic white clouds as he held the stranger whose life was slipping through his fingers. The cold bit mercilessly at his skin, but he hardly felt it. Every ounce of his attention was fixed on the man's faint. Uneven breaths, breaths that grew weaker, shallower, more distant with each passing second. "Stay with me," Reagan whispered desperately. "The bus is coming. Someone will help us. Just stay awake." But the man did not respond. The quiet of the morning felt suddenly immense. The wind, the snow, the empty road, all of it pressed inward. As though the world itself were holding its breath, Reagan looked down at the photograph lying beside him, half buried in the snow. He picked it up with trembling fingers. Despite everything happening around him, the image pulled his attention sharply. It showed a young girl, perhaps 10 or 11, standing in a field of tall grass. Her smile was bright, uninhibited, the kind of smile that belongs only to children who feel completely safe in the world. Sunlight glowed behind her, catching on her braids, forming a halo of gold around her small head, and in the bottom corner was a name, handwritten, Lily. Reagan felt a tightness in his chest, an unexpected ache that had nothing to do with the cold. He looked back at the man. "Is this her?" he whispered. "Is this who you wanted to see?" The man's eyes flickered open, just for a second. A second that would stay burned into Reagan's memory forever. "Yes," he breathed. "My little girl." Reagan swallowed hard. "Where is she?" The man struggled to form the words. "Gone years ago." Reagan closed his eyes, feeling something inside him break in a quiet, devastating way. "Tell her I tried," the man had said earlier. Reagan understood now it wasn't a message for someone living. It was a plea shaped by grief, a father's last confession. Reagan gripped the stranger's hand. "You did," he whispered. "You tried, and I'll remember her. I'll remember both of you." The man exhaled a final, fragile breath, a breath that drifted into the cold air and faded like smoke. Then he was still. Reagan didn't move. Not at first. He stayed there in the snow, holding the hand of a man he hadn't known an hour earlier, but felt connected to in a way he couldn't explain. The world around them remained silent, reverent, as though recognizing the solemnity of the moment. When the bus finally arrived and the driver jumped out, shouting in alarm, Reagan said nothing. He simply stepped back, letting others rush in, letting the weight of what had happened settle deep. Inside him, it was a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. The police came. Questions were asked. Statements were taken. Reagan answered what he could, though his voice felt distant, as if speaking from another room. The officers were kind in their own stoic way. Hard years had taught them the language of grief. They searched the man's pockets, looking for identification. But there was nothing. No wallet, no letters, no address, just the photograph. The officer examining it frowned. "You said you found this in his shoe?" Reagan nodded. The officer sighed. "We'll hold on to it until we can locate next of kin." But something inside Reagan recoiled at the thought. He couldn't explain why. Not fully. But the idea of the photograph being filed away in some cold office, stacked among forgotten possessions, felt wrong. It felt like a second loss. "May I?" Reagan began, then hesitated. "May I keep it? Just until you find someone?" The officer studied him. Most people wouldn't care. Most wouldn't ask, but this young man did. Finally, the officer handed it to him. "All right, but if anyone comes forward, we'll need it back." Of course, he slipped the photograph into his wallet, folding it carefully along the worn crease. It fit easily, as though it had always belonged there. Reagan made the bus to the interview, though he barely remembered the ride. And when the interviewer asked him questions about organization, punctuality, reliability, he answered politely, but without his usual warmth. The job was offered. He turned it down. He couldn't explain why. He just knew it wasn't where he needed to be. Instead, he walked out into the afternoon light feeling different, older somehow, quieter inside, as though something in him had been gently but permanently rearranged. For days afterward, he found himself reaching for his wallet, without knowing why. He would open it, take the photograph out, stare at the young girl named Lily. Sometimes he imagined her running through a field toward her father. Sometimes he imagined the man before grief hollowed him out. Sometimes he imagined what message the man had wanted to send. But more than anything, he thought about the look in the man's eyes, that mixture of sorrow and love that only a parent could hold. Weeks passed, then months, then years. Reagan went on to become a broadcaster, an actor, a governor, a president. But the photograph never left his wallet. During long nights on movie sets, when loneliness crept into the dressing room, he looked at it. During the pressures of public office, when he struggled with decisions and the weight of responsibility, he looked at it. During moments of doubt, when he questioned whether he was doing enough, whether he was enough, he looked at it because the photograph reminded him of three truths he had learned that cold winter, morning to one. Everyone is carrying something you cannot see. 2. A small act of kindness can be the last light in someone's darkness. 3. Love leaves a mark, even when the people gave it are gone. He often wondered whether keeping the photograph was strange, whether the man, if alive, would have wanted a stranger to carry the image of his daughter. But Reagan never let it go because, in a way, he had made a promise, not just to the dying man, but to himself. A promise to listen, a promise to care, a promise to see the humanity in people before seeing anything else. And decades later, when Alzheimer's began its slow and unforgiving drift into his mind, the photograph remained one of the few things he still recognized. Sometimes Nancy found him sitting alone, holding it gently between his fingers. She asked him about it once, just once. "Ronnie," she said softly, "who is the girl in that picture?" He looked at the photograph for a long time, his eyes unfocused but warm. Then he smiled, a soft, wistful smile. "Someone. I promise not to forget," he said. And that was all. He slipped the photograph back into his wallet as though tucking away a secret he cherished, too deeply to explain. Nancy didn't ask again. She didn't need to when Reagan passed. His belongings were collected by staff. Suits, letters, books, small keepsakes he'd gathered across his lifetime and inside his wallet, folded exactly the way he kept it for more than 50 years. They found Lily, still smiling, still glowing with sunlight, still carried by the man who refused to let her be lost again. The photograph was returned to his family, who asked the same question Nancy once had. Who is this little girl? And no one ever learned the full story, except us, except you, except the listeners who now know why. Ronald Reagan kept one photograph hidden all his life, a reminder of compassion, of sorrow, of love, of the fragile threads that bind stranger to stranger, a reminder of one quiet morning when the world changed for him in the snow, a reminder of a promise kept. If this story touched your heart, your support helps keep these quiet memories alive. Feel free to like, comment, or subscribe. It means more than you know, and it helps these gentle stories reach others who need them. Thank you for listening.